During the day, retail is defined by noise and high-volume transactions, but at 2 a.m., that environment changes. The bustling safety of a standard shift is replaced by absolute and total isolation. We usually rely on an unwritten social contract for protection. It's the idea that, in a crowd, under the eyes of witnesses, people will generally follow the rules. It's a passive safety net that most of us never even think about. But in the middle of the night, those witnesses are gone. The physical barriers of the daytime world vanish, leaving the person behind the counter alone, in a vacuum where the usual rules of public accountability no longer apply. Most night shift workers find themselves in a unique bind. Their job description requires them to be welcoming to every person who walks through the door, creating a specific type of vulnerability that exists nowhere else in the professional world. Meredith was 24 years old when she took a graveyard shift at a rural gas station. At 1 a.m. on a Thursday, a man in a green coat with messy hair walked in. He didn't head for the coffee or the snacks. He just stood at the counter. He didn't buy anything. Instead, he commented on the whiteboard behind the register. He noticed that when she wrote the word cinnamon, she used little slashes to dot her I's instead of circles. Meredith froze. She wasn't wearing a name tag, but the man calmly said her name. He had been watching her closely enough to learn her identity and her handwriting without her ever noticing his presence. Her internal alarm was ringing, but her professional training took over. Instead of locking the door or calling for help, she forced a polite smile and asked the man if he needed anything else. This is the specific hesitation that these encounters often hinge on. The worker's obligation to remain professional creates a window of time where they will ignore their own survival instincts just to avoid being perceived as rude. The man, Paul, began showing up at the station at irregular hours. He would stay in the shadows of the parking lot or stand at the counter and ask neutral, seemingly harmless questions about her shift. He slowly revealed how much he knew about her routine. He told her he'd noticed she always checks the locks on the back room at exactly 2 a.m., proving he had been observing her movements from the darkness outside for weeks. Eventually, the subtlety disappeared. Meredith returned from a 10-minute break to find a Polaroid photo sitting on the counter. It was a close-up of her working outside the night before, with specific words on the supply bin circled in red ink. When she finally confronted him and told him to leave, he didn't get angry. He spoke softly, telling her he was just a guy who pays attention, and that she was the kind of person who's used to being misunderstood. He was using the forced proximity of her job to manufacture a sense of intimacy. By framing his stalking as mere curiosity, he attempted to keep her in that polite, professional loop for as long as possible. In another instance, a hotel clerk checked in a man late at night, only to realize an hour later that the room he had assigned was still marked as vacant. The credit card hadn't been charged, and the door's electronic log showed no one had entered. The clerk looked over the desk and saw the man sitting in the lounge. He wasn't on his phone or reading, he was just staring straight ahead at a TV that wasn't even on. Even with the evidence right in front of him, the clerk hesitated. He spent 15 minutes watching the man, telling himself the system glitched or the guest was just tired. He even walked over to ask if he was okay. The brain has a powerful drive to frame terrifying anomalies as mundane events. We are conditioned to avoid social friction at almost any cost, so we loop through every possible logical excuse before we accept that a situation is actually dangerous. When you're behind a service desk, that drive is reinforced by a paycheck. The clerk became a passenger in the situation, paralyzed by the conflict between his role as a host and his instincts as a target. For Daniel, a night clerk at a rural motel, the tension broke at 2 a.m. when the front desk bell rang. He walked into the lobby, but it was empty. He checked the parking lot, but there wasn't a single car in sight. 10 minutes later, the bell rang again. He ran to the desk, but once more, the room was vacant. He stepped outside into the cold air and looked down the road, but nothing moved. He assumed someone was playing a prank. To catch them, he dimmed the lights and sat directly behind the front desk, staring at the silver bell on the counter, waiting for the prankster to show themselves. He sat in the silence for 20 minutes. And then a pale hand reached up from under the desk, right where Daniel's feet had been resting, and pressed the bell. At that moment, the illusion of the customer service role evaporated. The threat was no longer a guest or a prankster. It was an intruder who had already breached the only safe zone Daniel had. Daniel locked himself in the back office and called 911, watching the monitors as a man in a hoodie paced the lobby before disappearing. Meredith's stalker, Paul, was eventually arrested after police found a notepad in his car. The notepad was filled with her name, written over and over in loops that eventually turned into aggressive scribbles. He'd also documented her schedule, her clothes, and her groceries. Meredith moved to a different town and stopped working nights. Daniel still works at the motel, but he never sits with his back to that counter anymore. These events changed the way they view their own workspaces and the people who enter them. We often forget that our safety in public spaces depends on the presence of others. When those crowds go away, the social contract becomes much more fragile. If you are ever isolated in the dark, your safety might depend on your willingness to be perceived as rude. Survival in these moments doesn't come from a polite greeting. It comes from the moment you decide to trust your gut and drop the mask.